On December 25th, 1991, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. To the rest of the world, it looked like a political collapse. It looked like a victory for democracy or a defeat for communism. But if you looked at the ledger books inside the Ministry of Finance, you would have seen a different story. The Soviet Union didn't die because of an ideology. It didn't die because of a revolution. It died because it ran out of money. This is the story of the greatest bankruptcy in human history. It is the story of a superpower that possessed 40,000 nuclear warheads, but couldn't afford to buy bread. It is a lesson on what happens when a nation becomes addicted to a single resource, and what happens when the dealer finally cuts you off. To understand how a superpower goes broke, we have to go back to the moment they thought they were rich. The year was 1965. In the frozen wastelands of western Siberia, Soviet geologists made a discovery that would change the fate of the 20th century. They found oil, specifically the Samotlor field. It wasn't just an oil field, it was a sea of black gold. At the time, this seemed like a miracle. The Soviet economy was already slowing down. The communist system was struggling to produce consumer goods. But suddenly, they didn't need to produce good cars or televisions. They just needed to drill holes in the ground. Throughout the 1970s, the price of oil skyrocketed. The OPEC embargo against the West sent prices through the roof, and the Soviet Union became the biggest beneficiary. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow. It was the greatest lottery win in the history of the Russian state. But this wealth was a curse. It masked the rot. Because the oil money was so easy, the Soviet leadership stopped trying to fix their broken economy. Why reform the factories when you can just sell oil? Why fix the agriculture when you can just sell oil? The Soviet Union became a petro-state. It was essentially a third world economy with first world rockets. They stopped making things the world wanted to buy. They were exporting raw materials and importing everything else. They were trading the blood of the earth for food, for machines, and for silence. The leadership in the Kremlin used the oil windfall to buy loyalty. They subsidized food prices, keeping bread artificially cheap. They subsidized housing. They subsidized their satellite states in Eastern Europe. They built a massive military machine that consumed 20% of the GDP. It was a golden age, but it was built on a foundation of sand. The entire stability of the Soviet Union was pegged to one number, the price of a barrel of oil. As long as oil was over $30 a barrel, the Soviets were rich. They were invincible. They could invade Afghanistan. They could threaten Europe. They could race the Americans to space. But in the early 1980s, the math began to change. The United States and Saudi Arabia were watching. They realized that the Soviet bear was actually a junkie, and its drug was high oil prices. In the commodities markets, a storm was gathering. The demand for oil was dropping as the West became more energy efficient. At the same time, new oil supply was coming online from the North Sea and Alaska. The price was wobbling. And then, the Soviet agriculture sector collapsed. This is the part of the story that is often forgotten. The Soviet Union, which possessed some of the most fertile farmland on Earth in Ukraine, could not feed itself. The collective farm system was so inefficient that half the potatoes would rot in the fields before they reached the store. So, the superpower had to buy grain, millions of tons of it. And who were they buying it from? They were buying it from their arch-enemy, the United States. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was spending nearly half of its hard currency earnings just to import grain to feed its people. They were selling oil to the West to buy wheat from the West. It was a humiliating cycle of dependency. But the Kremlin wasn't worried. They looked at their oil charts and saw the money pouring in. They thought the party would last forever. They didn't realize that they were walking on the edge of a cliff and the ground was about to give way. The timeline for the apocalypse was set. The Soviet Union was about to face the perfect economic storm. The year is 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev enters the Kremlin. He's young, energetic, and he knows the system is stagnant. But even he doesn't realize how close to the edge they are. He thinks the Soviet Union has a cold. In reality, it has terminal cancer. Gorbachev announced a grand plan, perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to modernize the economy, invest in machine building, and make Soviet industry competitive again. To pay for this massive investment, he needed cash. He looked at the budget and assumed the oil revenue would be there to fund it. He was wrong. On September 13, 1985, the Saudi oil minister Ahmed Zaki Yamani declared that Saudi Arabia was tired of holding back production to keep prices high. They were going to open the taps. They flooded the market with cheap oil. The result was a massacre. In 1980, oil was at $35 a barrel. By 1986, it crashed to $10 a barrel. For the Soviet Union, this was a death sentence. In the blink of an eye, the empire lost half of its income. Imagine if you suddenly lost half your salary, but your mortgage, your car payments, and your grocery bills stayed the same. The Soviet budget was calculated based on expensive oil. Suddenly, there was a massive hole in the ledger. Tens of billions of dollars evaporated. This happened at the worst possible moment. The Soviet Union was bogged down in a costly war in Afghanistan. They were sending millions of dollars a day to prop up regimes in Cuba, Vietnam, and Angola. They were trying to maintain a nuclear parity with America's Star Wars program, and they still had to buy the grain. The grain ships were arriving in Odessa every week, demanding payment in hard currency, dollars or gold. The Soviets couldn't pay in rubles because the ruble was a soft currency. It was worthless outside the Soviet Union. You couldn't use rubles to buy American wheat or German machines. You needed real money. So Gorbachev faced a choice. He could cut military spending, which would anger the generals. He could cut food subsidies, which would anger the people. Or he could borrow. He chose to borrow. The Soviet Union began to take out massive loans from Western banks. German banks, French banks, British banks. They were happy to lend. After all, this was a superpower. A superpower doesn't go bankrupt, right? The Soviets had a perfect credit rating. They had massive gold reserves. They seemed like a safe bet. So the loans flowed in, but this wasn't investment capital. This wasn't money being used to build factories that would generate profit later. This was survival money. The Soviets were borrowing billions just to buy food and consumer goods to keep the shelves from looking completely empty. It was a credit card spiral. They were borrowing to eat. To make matters worse, Gorbachev made a domestic economic mistake that accelerated the collapse. He launched an anti-alcohol campaign. He saw that vodka was destroying the health of the Soviet worker, so he restricted sales and destroyed vineyards. Morally, it was the right thing to do. Economically, it was suicide. The tax on vodka was one of the largest sources of revenue for the state, second only to oil. By restricting vodka sales, Gorbachev wiped out another huge chunk of the budget. And the people didn't stop drinking. They just started brewing moonshine at home. So the state got zero revenue, and the sugar disappeared from the stores because people were buying it all to make alcohol. By 1988, the deficit was spiraling out of control. The government started doing the one thing you should never do. They turned on the printing presses. They printed rubles to pay the workers' wages. But because there were no goods in the shops to buy, the money just piled up. This is called a monetary overhang. The people had pockets full of cash, but the stores were empty. The shortage economy kicked into high gear. People would stand in line for 4 hours for a loaf of bread. If they saw a line, they would join it without even asking what was being sold. It might be shoes, it might be sausages, it might be toilet paper. You grabbed whatever you could, because tomorrow it would be gone. The social contract was breaking. The Soviet people had tolerated the lack of freedom because the state provided stability. They had cheap rent and guaranteed food. Now the stability was gone. The shelves were bare. The money was worthless. And the West was watching. The banks in London and Frankfurt started to get nervous. They noticed that the Soviet Union was borrowing just to pay the interest on previous loans. The debt had exploded from almost zero to $50 billion in just a few years. The bankers realized that the emperor had no clothes, and more importantly, he had no cash. By 1989, the Soviet economy wasn't just stalling, it was disintegrating. The Berlin Wall fell. The satellite states in Eastern Europe broke free. To the world, this looked like a political liberation. But to the accountants in Moscow, it was a financial catastrophe. For decades, the Soviet Union had forced Eastern Europe to trade in a closed loop. Now, those countries demanded to be paid in dollars for their goods. And the entire trading bloc collapsed. Inside the Kremlin, panic set in. The gold reserves were vanishing. In the mid-'80s, the Soviets had tons of gold bars in the vault. By 1990, they were secretly flying gold to London and Zurich, selling it in a panic just to pay for the next shipment of wheat. They sold so much gold so quickly that they depressed the global price, getting even less value for their desperation. Then, the War of Laws began. This was the final internal blow. The Soviet republics, Russia, Ukraine, the Baltics, started to withhold tax revenue from the central government. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of the Russian Republic, told his tax collectors, "Keep the money here, don't send it to Gorbachev." The Central Soviet budget evaporated. Gorbachev was the president of a superpower, but he had no income. He commanded the nuclear missiles, but he couldn't pay the guards who watched them. In 1990, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union started defaulting on its commercial payments. Ships full of frozen meat and butter anchored off the coast of Leningrad refused to dock. The captains radioed that they wouldn't unload the cargo until the check cleared. But the checks were bouncing. The Soviet government had to beg. They went to the West, hat in hand. They asked for humanitarian aid. It was a humiliation. The nation that had defeated Hitler, the nation that had put the first man in space, was now asking Germany for care packages of powdered milk and canned beef. The Veneshikonombank, the Soviet Bank for Foreign Economic Affairs, froze all accounts. Soviet companies that had earned hard currency through trade woke up one morning to find their accounts empty. The state had confiscated their money to pay the national debt. It was theft on a national scale. Trust was completely destroyed. The ruble ceased to function as money. The economy switched to barter. Factories paid their workers in tires or crystal glasses or whatever they produced. Workers would then stand on the side of the road, trying to trade a set of tires for a bag of potatoes. The black market became the only real market. The dollar became the only real currency. Taxi drivers, prostitutes, and waiters were the new elite because they had access to foreign cash. Professors and scientists were paupers. In August 1991, hardline communists launched a coup against Gorbachev. They parked tanks in Red Square. They wanted to restore order. They wanted to turn back the clock. But they forgot one thing. You can't shoot economics. The coup leaders didn't have a plan to fix the debt. They didn't have a plan to put food on the shelves. The coup collapsed, not just because the people resisted, but because the plotters realized they were fighting for the captain's chair on the Titanic, and the ship was already underwater. When Gorbachev returned to power after the coup, he was a ghost. The power had shifted to Boris Yeltsin in the republics, but the debt remained. The Western banks, the G7, called a meeting. They were terrified. The Soviet Union owed nearly $70 billion. If the country broke apart, who would pay the debt? Would Ukraine pay? Would Kazakhstan pay? They demanded a joint and several responsibility agreement. They told the republics, we don't care who's in charge, but someone has to sign for this debt. In the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed only on paper. There was no money for the November payroll. There was no money for the December payroll. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day, printing large denomination banknotes that were worth less than the paper they were printed on. Hyperinflation had arrived. December 1991, the end of the line. The Central Bank of the Soviet Union, Gazbank, was insolvent. They had literally run out of gold. The legendary reserves, rumored to be thousands of tons, were gone. Investigating prosecutors later found only about 240 tons left in the vaults. The rest had been sold, stolen, or wasted in the desperate attempt to keep the system afloat for just one more month. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev sat at his desk to sign his resignation. He didn't resign because he was conquered by an invading army. He resigned because he had lost the ability to write checks. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist, but the ghost of the empire lingered in the ledger books. The new Russian Federation, led by Boris Yeltsin, inherited the seat at the UN. It inherited the nuclear codes, and it inherited the debt. Russia agreed to take on 100% of the Soviet Union as foreign debt in exchange for claiming all the Soviet Union as foreign assets, the embassies, and the remaining gold. It was a zero-option deal. This debt burden crushed the new Russia. Throughout the 1990s, the new democratic government was strangled by the interest payments on the loans taken out by the communists. The shock therapy, economic reforms that followed were a direct result of this bankruptcy. There was no money to cushion the transition. Subsidies were slashed overnight. Prices for food skyrocketed by 2,000%. The life savings of millions of ordinary Russians were wiped out in a matter of days. The poverty that followed was horrific. But it wasn't caused by the collapse of 1991. It was caused by the addiction of the 1970s. The pain of the 1990s was the withdrawal symptom from the oil high. It took years for Russia to climb out of the hole. In 1998, Russia defaulted again, crashing the global markets once more. It wasn't until the oil prices started to rise again in the 2000s that the debts were finally cleared. In 2017, Russia paid off the last remaining debt of the Soviet Union, a payment to Bosnia-Herzegovina. It took 26 years to close the account of a dead empire. The fall of the Soviet Union is the ultimate cautionary tale of the resource curse. It teaches us that natural resources are not the same as economic strength. The Soviets thought they were rich because they had oil. They confused luck with genius. They used the easy money to mask their structural problems, to buy social peace, and to hide their inefficiencies. They built a superpower on a foundation of commodities. They pegged their survival to a number on a trading screen in London. When that number dropped, the nuclear warheads couldn't save them. The KGB couldn't save them. The ideology couldn't save them. An empire that cannot pay for its bread is not an empire. It is a ticking time bomb. In the end, the Cold War wasn't won by a missile. It was won by a grain shipment that the Soviets couldn't afford to buy. The hammer and sickle didn't fall. It went bankrupt. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.